In this video, I'm going to be answering the question, what genre do the Gospels belong to? And why is this important for their historical reliability? If this is your first time watching, my name is Ryan Lazier. I'm a pastor and a PhD student in biblical studies. For the greater part of the 20th century, many biblical scholars rejected the idea that the Gospels were ancient biographies. Instead, they contended that the Gospels belonged to a unique genre all by themselves, no genre at all. In fact, the German form critics used this phrase sui generis, which meant unique or of its own kind, to describe the Gospels because they were convinced there was nothing else like them. According to the form critics, the Gospels don't really tell us much about the historical Jesus, so they shouldn't be labeled biography. Instead, the Gospels tell us more about the Sitzumleben, or the life situation of the early Christian communities. In a previous video, we considered the form critics' claims that the early church changed the authentic stories about Jesus to make them more useful for their current setting. For example, because the early church needed to justify their worship of Jesus, they embellished stories about Jesus that made it appear that he was actually divine. But according to the form critics, those accounts in the Gospels that present the deity of Christ don't actually go back to the historical Jesus. Additionally, the form critics denied that the evangelists were authors in and of their own right. Instead, they were simply compilers of various forms that had been passed down to them. Each of the evangelists then brought all these different forms together, like one would slide pearls onto a string. In short, the Gospels were simply the sum of their parts and nothing more. No creative biographer stood behind them. As prominent form critic Carl Schmitt writes, a gospel is by nature not high literature, but low literature, not the product of an individual author, but a folk book, not a biography, but a cult legend. Comments like this led Graham Stanton to quip, to many of the form critics, the very word biography was like a red rag to a bull. It's because form critics were convinced that the Gospels were utterly unique works. The most famous of all the form critics, Rudolf Bultmann, writes this, must we look around for analogies to the explanation of the form of the gospel? What analogies can be suggested? There are none in the Greek tradition. He goes on to argue, it is hardly possible to speak of the Gospels as a literary genus. The gospel belongs to the history of dogma and worship. The Gospels, then, are a compilation of forms or passages that were more or less invented by the early church to support the doctrine that they wished to propagate. In other words, these were pragmatic texts, useful texts, but not historical texts. Well, in the rest of this video, I'm going to push back against the claim that the Gospels didn't belong to any known genre at the time and that they don't tell us anything about the historical Jesus. Instead, I'm going to argue that the Gospels do, in fact, belong to the category of ancient Greco-Roman biography, sometimes referred to as lives or bioi in the Greek. And if the Gospels are ancient biography, that has significant implications for how we should understand their intent. After all, authors of ancient biography were actually trying to tell us true things about true people. So, why then should we think that the Gospels belong to ancient biography? Let me give you 5 reasons why. Number 1, a unique genre is utterly nonsensical. Just consider for a moment, can you think of any book or writing that belongs to a unique genre all by itself? In other words, there's no other work that has similar characteristics to it. Can you think of just one? Probably not, because I'm doubtful that such a work exists. You see, while an author may push the boundaries of a certain genre, or he may even combine or blend genres together, an author must necessarily employ a known genre in order to get his message across to his audience. Without a conventional genre, the content would not possess any meaning at all. As Richard Burridge remarks, genre establishes a set of expectations, a kind of contract between author and reader to guide interpretation of the text. Meaning, without a genre, one wouldn't know how to interpret a text. Let's just do a quick thought experiment for a minute. Suppose a child read in a book the following words: Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. And next to these words, they showed a character who looked like a giant egg laying miserably on the ground, all broken apart. After reading this text and seeing this picture, the child's heart immediately goes out to poor Humpty Dumpty. He begins crying uncontrollably at the pain and suffering that Humpty Dumpty must be going through. The child then determines that he is going to go find Humpty Dumpty and put him back together again, since none of the king's horses and men could do so. And so he packs a bag and he sets out on a journey to go to the place where he thinks all of this must have happened. You see, instead of seeing the text as a nursery rhyme that's simply meant for amusement for young children, the child thought that this was a news report that was to be acted upon. Or consider another example. Suppose one day an adult was reading a weather report that warned of a Category 5 hurricane that was heading to his area. And the report said that the hurricane was most likely going to destroy the area, and so everyone needed to evacuate immediately. However, upon reading this report, the man put down the report and thought to himself, this is interesting. I wonder how this thriller is going to end. Well, clearly, in this situation, he has completely misunderstood the meaning of the text. He thought it was a thriller meant to entertain him and leave him in suspense, when in reality it was an actual, real report that was intended for him to act upon, to leave the area. Well, in both of these situations, the author was not able to get his point across because the audience had no idea what the genre was. It wasn't clear to the reader. After all, genre establishes a set of expectations that are shared between the author and the reader. Only when both know the rules of how a genre works can the message be accurately conveyed. Well, the same goes for the Gospels. If they belong to an utterly unique genre, the readers are going to have no clue how they're supposed to interpret them because they don't know the rules of that particular genre. They'll simply be baffled. They won't know what to do with them, much like the reader of Humpty Dumpty and the weather report. As Helen Bond writes, genre plays an important role here in alerting readers to what range of readings are probable, even likely, and setting constraints and limits on those that are not. You see, genre establishes parameters or constraints for the interpreter. It keeps the reader from going off course because the author and the reader have this mutual understanding for how this type of literature works. If the Gospels really were an utterly unique genre, totally foreign to the reader might decide to read it like a poem or like a romance novel. But that would certainly miss the author's intentions. Since authors most certainly want their readers and the audience to understand what they're saying, they use genres that their audience is familiar with. This is why we can enjoy certain books like Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, because we are familiar with fantasy and we understand how that genre works. Now, to be sure, the Gospels do contain some unique features that are not shared by other Greco-Roman biographies. Specifically, these are texts that are rooted in the Jewish scriptures, and they follow after many patterns that are found in Old Testament narratives. As David Aune writes, the message is Christian, the background of the message, the soil in which it grew is Jewish, but the form is Hellenistic biography. In other words, while the form is Greco-Roman biography, the content is Jewish. Similarly, Patrick Schreiner contends, the combination of these two genres, that is, ancient biography and Old Testament narratives, instructs readers both that Matthew presents Jesus as a figure to emulate and that this story is the climax of the great narrative of Israel. The Jewishness of the Gospels is a unique feature not shared with other ancient biographies. Nevertheless, this does not mean that they don't belong to the same genre as other ancient biographies. In fact, most ancient biographies contain unique features themselves. As many historians will note, Greco-Roman biography was an incredibly flexible genre. So much so that scholars have classified them into several subcategories. Richard Burridge, for example, gives 7 such categories. He lists them as encomiastic, exemplary, informative, entertainment, memory preservation, didactic, and apologetic. Others classify them based upon the subject's career, whether they be political, military, poet, orator, or sage. In short, no cookie-cutter biographies exist. Though they may overlap in many ways, ancient biographies are all unique in a certain sense. Lucian's Demonox is not exactly like Plutarch's Alexander, which is not exactly like the Gospel of Mark. Number 2. A second reason to think the Gospels are biographies is because they contain the same features as other ancient biographies. One such feature is that they place an extreme emphasis on one main character. Perhaps no one has demonstrated this emphasis more than Richard Burridge. Using computer analysis on dozens of ancient works, Burridge calculated the percentage of sentences where the main character in a work was the subject of the verb or the speaker of the verb. Now, just by way of comparison with non-biographical works, he discovered that Achilles in Homer's Iliad, he and Hector are the 2 main characters. Achilles is either the acting or the speaking subject in 6.3 of all the sentences, while Hector, the other main character, is found in 7.8% of all sentences. In Herodotus, Book 6, the main character, King Darius, is either the acting or the speaking subject in 4.4% of all those sentences. In Herodotus, Books 6 through 9, where Xerxes is the most prominent figure, he appears in 8.9% of all the sentences as either the subject or the speaker of the verb. Now, these are the main characters in non-biographical works. How then do these percentages compare with ancient biographies? Well, with respect to Satyrus's Life of Euripides, Euripides is either the subject or the speaker of the verb in 43.3% of all sentences. In Plutarch's Life of Cato Manor, Cato is the subject or speaker of the verb in 57.4% of all sentences. In Plutarch's Life of Julius Caesar, Caesar is the subject or the speaker of the verb in 45.4% of all of its sentences. In Lucian's Life of Demonox, Demonox is the subject or the speaker of the verb in 53.3% of all sentences. Clearly, compared to other works, ancient biography disproportionately emphasizes one main character at the expense of everyone else in the work. Now, what about the 4 Gospels? Well, with respect to Mark, Burridge discovered that Jesus is the subject or the speaker of the verb in 44.6% of all sentences. In Matthew, it's 59.7%. In Luke, it's 54.7%. And in John, it's 54.2% of all sentences. These percentages are consistent with other ancient biographies. Moreover, biographers had a purpose in focusing so much attention on their subjects. They wished to reveal the moral character of their main subjects. You see, biographers selected material that they believed would highlight their subjects' qualities. They did not simply intend to report the facts. They wished to tell a captivating story that would compel their readers to live better lives themselves. Perhaps this is what the early Greek biographer Plutarch was getting at in his preface to his biography on Alexander the Great. There he wrote, "For it is not histories that I am writing, but lives." Bioi there in the Greek. While Plutarch's delineation has led some to believe that bioi are less than historical, the truth is that lives and history overlap significantly. The main difference is that lives focused only on one individual with the purpose of highlighting his virtue or his vice. In other words, biography is a subset of history with a moralistic twist. Here's Plutarch elsewhere. "I began the writing of my lives for the sake of others, but I find that I am continuing the work and delighting in it now for my own sake also, using history as a mirror and endeavoring in a manner to fashion and adorn my life in conformity to the virtues therein depicted." Christopher Pelling, one of the world's leading authorities on Plutarch, asks, "Why this interest in character?" Plutarch's answer is again clear. He hopes that his readers might be led by examples of virtue to become better men themselves. Another person who's done a lot of research in the field of ancient bioi is Helen Bond. She writes, "Two features of ancient biographical writing stand out clearly. First, a concern to commemorate a great life, and second, a moralistic desire to learn from it." Therefore, the evangelists do not merely intend to report bare facts about Jesus. They wish to write a captivating story, a captivating narrative about him that would compel their readers to pursue virtue themselves. Another feature the Gospels share with ancient biography is their length and structure. Here again, Burridge demonstrates that the Gospels align nicely with other contemporary Greco-Roman biographies. One observation that Burridge makes is that the average scroll length in antiquity allowed from anywhere to 10 to 25,000 words, depending on the size of one's handwriting, and this was the typical length of a biography. Genres, though, such as history or epics or philosophical works, usually exceeded this length. For example, the histories of Herodotus contain over 189,000 words, while Thucydides' history on the Peloponnesian War contains 153,000 words. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey contain 115,000 and 87,000 words, respectively. Plato's Republic contains 89,000 words, while Aristotle's Physics contains 57,000 words. These non-biographical works clearly exceed the word limit of typical biographies, which again were 10 to 25,000 words. There's other genres, though, like orations, hymns, tragedies, or comedies that were usually much shorter. In fact, several of these could be found on one single scroll itself. For instance, the speeches of Demosthenes range from 1 to 5,000 words. Most ancient hymns were actually under 100 words, and plays typically ranged between 5 and 10,000 words. Biographies, again, typically ranged from 10 to 25,000 words. It seems, then, that the word count for ancient biography was often dictated by the length of the scrolls. Martin Hengel observes that, as a general rule, for technical reasons alone, an author was compelled to keep his material within strict limits. He had to make careful plans in advance so that his work would be the right length, since there was comparatively little room on papyrus scrolls. He goes on to suggest that the length of the four Gospels and Acts was determined by the fact that they are deliberately limited to one scroll. With very few exceptions, most biographies land within this range of 10 to 25,000 words. Plutarch's works, such as Cato Manor, is about 16,000 words, Alexander, 20,000 words, and Pompey, 20,000 words. They all fall within this average length. Suetonius's Lives of the Caesars frequently fall within this range as well. For example, his Augustus is roughly 16,000 words, and Julius Caesar is just over 12,000 words. Similarly, the four Gospels all fall within this average range. Matthew, about 18,000 words, Mark, 11,000 words, Luke, 19,000 words, and John, about 15,000 words. Not only do the Gospels share the same length as the average biography, they also share the same basic structure of an introduction, a topically arranged middle section, and a lengthy narrative surrounding the subject's death. Their introductions, however, could come in different sizes and shapes, and Burridge summarizes this diversity well. He writes, "If we compare the Synoptic Gospels with other biographies, we note that Matthew goes straight into the subject's ancestry, like Nepos and Plutarch. Mark, however, like Xenophon, begins with just one sentence, while some of Plutarch's lives start straight in, for example, Timoleon. Luke's use of a preface can be paralleled in Lucian and Philo, who have a paragraph each, and in Isocrates, Tacitus, and Philostratus, who all have a more extended prologue. Thus, the various beginnings of the Synoptic Gospels reflect the range of possibilities for bioi with respect to an opening sentence or preface. The flexibility with the introduction corresponds with the 2nd century author Lucian's instructions to other ancient historians, especially when writing about a well-known figure. He says, "After all the historian's preparations are made, he will sometimes begin without a preface when the subject matter requires no preliminary exposition." In other words, if the subject is well known and requires no introduction, the author can just skip the introduction and jump straight into the narrative. So, while many used to argue that Mark was not a Greco-Roman biography because it lacked a birth account or an introduction, that reasoning fails to consider that Greco-Roman biographies often lacked birth accounts and introductions. Additionally, while ancient bioi followed a basic chronological framework, beginning with an introduction and ending with the subject's death, the large middle section was often arranged topically. This, for example, is how Lucian's Demonox is structured, and many other biographies as well. And this is a pattern that we see reoccur in the Gospels also. Consider, for example, the Gospel of Matthew. It has a basic chronological framework. It begins with the infancy account, and then Jesus' baptism, which launches his public career, and then it ends with the Passion Week. And in between those sections, though, we have a lengthy section that is arranged topically. For instance, he lumps most of Jesus' teachings together in 5 major discourses, the most famous of which is the Sermon on the Mount. He places most of Jesus' parables in Matthew 13, and he places most of Jesus' miracles in chapters 8 and 9. Now, we know these aren't in chronological order because Mark and Luke rearranged them differently. Yet this topical arrangement was typical for Greco-Roman biography. Referring specifically to the Gospel of Mark, Helen Bond remarks, Mark's lack of chronology would not have struck an ancient audience as odd in any way. Finally, detailed descriptions of the subject's death played a significant role in biography. After all, as David Aune contends, according to a Greek conception, a person's life could be evaluated only when completed by death. The way in which one died either confirmed the subject's virtue or revealed that he was a fraud. As Helen Bond explains, of all the events of a person's life, that which perhaps exerted the most fascination for biographers was death. That moment of transition, the almost sacred transfer from existence to nothingness, was often seen as the point when a man's true character might at last be revealed. This infatuation with the subject's death explains why the evangelists spend an inordinate amount of time on Jesus' death. Matthew and Luke, for example, devote just over 15% of their narrative to the Passion account, while Mark and John are closer to 20%. Now, compare these percentages with other ancient biographers who did similar things. For instance, Plutarch spent 17.3% on death narratives, Nepos 15%, Tacitus 10%, and Philostratus 26%. In short, the Gospel's lengthy passion narratives are quite normal for ancient biography. Knowing that a lengthy death narrative was normal for ancient biography would rule against Martin Coller's often cited claim that the Gospels are passion narratives with extended introductions. After all, that phrase suggests that the Gospels are a unique genre in and of themselves. They created the Gospels to provide some kind of background material so they could highlight the doctrine of Jesus' substitutionary death and resurrection. But again, as the data shows, lengthy passion narratives were just a typical feature of ancient biography. Number 3. A third reason to believe the Gospels are ancient biographies is that form critics wrongly compared the Gospels to modern biographies. Many scholars wrongly assumed that since the Gospels don't bear much resemblance to modern biographies, they must not be biographies at all. Modern biographies, after all, contain features such as scientific precision or descriptions of the person's appearance or psychological analysis or character development or educational background. None of these things, however, are in the Gospels. Yet, it should be obvious that the Gospels aren't modern biographies. They're ancient ones. Martin Coller fails to see his anachronistic projection when he laments that we have no sources for a biography of Jesus of Nazareth which measure up to the standards of contemporary historical science. Bultmann makes a similar error when he writes, there is no historical biographical interest in the Gospels, and that is why they have nothing to say about Jesus' human personality, his appearance and his character, his origin, education, and development. Now, this kind of reasoning does not pass muster. It would be like claiming that a classic Ford Model T is not a car because it doesn't possess many of the features that we find in modern cars, like a GPS system, air conditioning, or cruise control. David Aune sees the problems with this logic when he writes, "While it is true that the Gospels are not biography if measured by modern historical standards, I believe it can be shown that they are biography as that literary genre was understood in the Greco-Roman world." Similarly, Craig Keener adds, critics were correct to notice that the Gospels are not modern biographies. They erred only in concluding that this meant that they were not ancient ones. In other words, those scholars who denied the biographical nature of the Gospels did so illegitimately because they were projecting 20th century biographical standards back into the first century. But the Gospels are not 20th century works. They're first century works, and as we just saw, they fit nicely within the first century genre of Greco-Roman biography. Number 4, most of church history saw these works as biographies. As early as the 2nd century, people thought of the Gospels as biographies. Justin Martyr famously refers to the Gospels as the memoirs several times throughout his work. In one such place, he says, "The memoirs were drawn up by his apostles and those who followed them." This is a clear reference to the Gospels. The memoirs by the apostles must be referring to Matthew and John, and the memoirs by those who followed the apostles must be referring to Mark and Luke. Now, the Greek word behind the word memoir is apomnemonumata, which means something like recollections or reminiscences. This is also the same word used by Papias in the early 2nd century when he refers to Mark's gospel. Consider his words. "This also the presbyter said. Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not indeed in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ." Notice the word remembered there. It's the same Greek root word behind memoir. It's the memories or reminiscences Peter had of Christ. It's also important to note that this is the same Greek word used by Xenophon as a title for his biography on Socrates. It's usually translated as Xenophon's Memorabilia, which is a Latinized form. But the original Greek word was Xenophon's Apomnemonumata, his memoirs on Socrates. Xenophon, who was a student of Socrates, wrote this work to defend Socrates against his accusers by highlighting his piety and sharing some of the dialogues he had with his students. Here's Helen Bond. Although memoir was a rather loose literary genre, the use of the same term to refer to both Xenophon's collection of anecdotes relating to Socrates and to what were now known as Christian Gospels does suggest that Papias and Justin, and presumably others, assumed that they belonged to the same category of broadly biographical literature. And the truth is, basically everyone agreed with this assessment up until the beginning of the 20th century, when the German form critics began suggesting that the Gospels belonged to a unique genre all by themselves. After all, if they belonged to ancient biography, that would suggest the texts contained biographical information about Jesus of Nazareth, but the form critics could not accept this. They argued instead that the Gospels were more like folk literature that gave us a window into the life of the early church communities. Fortunately, thanks to the work of people like Richard Burridge and others, the tide has now shifted back to the original consensus that the Gospels belong to the genre of ancient biography. As Helen Bond remarks, while talk of consensus in New Testament studies is always risky, the view that the Gospels are best understood as ancient bioi has certainly become a dominant scholarly position. The Catholic scholar Brant Pitre is even more forceful in his conclusion. The old idea that the Gospels are not biographies but folklore and fairy stories completely fails to reckon with the literary evidence. It is long since time for it to be consigned to the trash bin of history. The Gospels are biographies. And now a fifth reason to think the Gospels are ancient biographies is that they relied upon historical sources. Ancient biographies, after all, were not created out of thin air. Biographers such as Suetonius and Plutarch relied heavily upon earlier sources as they composed their works. Christopher Pelling tells us that Plutarch drew on a fairly wide range of material. Though Plutarch had his favorite sources that he relied on most heavily, Pelling tells us that Plutarch relied upon dozens of sources for his biographies. These sources could either be oral or written. As Craig Keener remarks, Research shows that ancient biographers depended heavily on prior information in composing biographies, a characteristic we would not expect in, for example, ancient novels. Reliance upon earlier historical sources was a basic expectation of ancient biography. If biographers were going to get their facts straight, they needed to do their research, and the Gospels are no different. As we saw earlier in the quote from Papias, Mark relied heavily on Peter's eyewitness testimony when he composed his Gospel. Similarly, Luke begins his Gospel by claiming that he investigated the sources as well. Here's Luke 1. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. In other words, Luke didn't invent the story out of thin air. He relied on earlier sources, both oral and written. While Matthew doesn't give us a statement on his use of sources, most scholars agree that at minimum he relied on Mark and some other sources. Now, just as a quick aside, in a couple of weeks I'm going to do a few videos on this literary relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, a relationship that's oftentimes referred to as the synoptic problem. Now, John's sources are a little less forthcoming, though it does claim to be based on the eyewitness testimony of the beloved disciple, and I think a good case can be made that he knew the first three Gospels as well. Now, depending on previous sources, suggests, at minimum, that ancient biographers attempted to report accurate history, and that they weren't trying to make stuff up. Matthew and Luke's use of Mark would suggest further that they trusted Mark as a reliable source containing true information. We're also able to see how Matthew and Luke used Mark, how they followed him rather closely in their own Gospels. And if they followed Mark this closely, I think it's reasonable to assume that they followed their other sources closely as well. In other words, I don't think there's information in the Gospels that they just made up. Now, this dependence on sources distinguishes Gospels from other non-historical genres. As Helen Bond notes, unlike novelists who were free to invent character in any way they pleased, ancient biographers dealt with real-life people who existed already prior to the biographer's literary endeavors, perhaps in a variety of literary and cultural traditions. Similarly, Craig Keener writes, ancient biographies differ from ancient novels in that they make use of sources. It should also be noted that given the standard dating of the Gospels, usually estimated between 3 and 5 decades after the death of Jesus, the evangelists allowed for an ideal time to pass before they wrote their Gospels. If written while the subject was still living, the biographer may have been tempted to skew the facts for ulterior purposes. As the 2nd century writer Lucian argues, the historian's sole task is to tell the tale as it happened. This he cannot do as long as he is afraid of Artaxerxes when he is his physician, or hopes to get a purple kufta, a golden necklet, and a Nicaean horse as a reward for the eulogies in his work. Lucian knew the real-life temptations that ancient writers faced. They were susceptible to bribes, and they feared for their lives just like everyone else. Therefore, waiting till after the subject had died would guard against the pressure to quote-unquote fudge the facts. At the same time, if the biographer waited too long, his sources that he relies upon may not be as reliable. Craig Keener is correct to note that the ideal setting for historical writing is distant enough to avoid myopia, yet within the period of living memory. Now, the standard dating for each of the Gospels then places them in this Goldilocks zone, which allowed for enough time for some historical perspective on Jesus, but without missing out on the best and most reliable sources. Martin Hengel summarizes this point well. He writes, "The development of the biography of Alexander and the Jesus biographies of the Gospels begins from a relatively trustworthy historical report. It was not free invention." So in summary, there are 5 reasons for thinking that the Gospels belong to the genre of Greco-Roman biography. First, The argument that the Gospels belonged to a unique genre was shown to be utterly nonsensical. Second, the Gospels possess many of the same features as other ancient biographies, such as an emphasis on one main character as well as a similar length and structure. Third, the form critics' arguments against the Gospel's biographical nature was based on an illegitimate comparison with modern biographies. Fourth, for most of church history, including the earliest centuries, the Gospels were seen as biographies. And fifth, the Gospels rely upon historical sources, which supports the idea that the authors were writing about a real person who did real things in the recent past. In the next video, we're going to take this discussion further by considering the differences that are in the Gospels. In other words, if these works are biographies and the authors were attempting to get all the details right about Jesus, why do they differ from one another? In some cases, look like they might even contradict each other. Well, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to hit like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.